Hi, everybody. Welcome to Collect Our Cousins, engaging white people in the struggle for full democracy. I'm Karen Flushman, founder of Racy Conversations, and this is a weekly LinkedIn Live series every Thursday morning at 8 a.m. Pacific, 11 a.m. Eastern. I'm going to be interviewing the folks who inspire me the most to do the work of engaging white people in the struggle for full democracy. And I'm super excited to bring Lynn Burnett to the stage in just a moment. But I want to share a little bit about why I'm doing this. Um, uh, I want to help white Americans like me become more effective in our conversations with white people in our lives so we can build the white anti-racist movement to help build an embodied anti-racist white culture, in the words of Resma Menachem. White Americans, the battle for our democracy will not be won in courtrooms or in the streets. It must be won in white dining room tables, uh, uh, neighborhood meetings, boardrooms, school board meetings. And as an anti racist, I'm ashamed to admit that collecting my cousins often falls to the end of my to do list. Oh, I'll get to that next month. But I want to encourage everyone who's watching to make a list of our friends and family who we are going to collect this year and start making those phone calls. If some of those relationships have languished, start reigniting the relationship so we can bring them in to this movement. And I'm super grateful for Lynn Burnett joining us this morning. Lynn is the founder of the White Anti-Racist Ancestors Project and of Cultural Solidarity. He is a former high school teacher, and he's really great writer. And he is reaching out to white living elders in in this movement who have been engaged in this work for decades and recording their stories, sharing their stories, as well as writing about white anti-racist heroes from the past. And I'm so glad to have him here today. And Lynn, I want to share how we met. Lynn and I were both very involved in the Justice for Mario Woods coalition after SFPD executed Mario Woods, who was a 26-year-old Black man, in December of 2015. So Lynn and I got to know each other really well in meetings. There was a hunger strike. We spent a lot of time in conversation with each other. And I was so impressed by Lynn's commitment and intelligence and compassion. And I'm embarrassed to admit that as I was reaching out to Lynn to join us today, I saw in my messages from Lynn, he had invited me to so many white anti-racist reading groups. He'd invited me to coffee, all of this stuff. And I did not respond to any of those invitations. And I think what was going through my mind at that time is like, why would I want to sit around with a bunch of white people talking about white people? Like, that is not my work to do. And in hindsight, that was a huge mistake on my part. And I would have really benefited from spending some time and continue to do that. And that's a practice I'm cultivating now, uh, meeting with white people and working through our shit collectively. So I'm sorry, Lynn. Thank you for all those invitations. Thank you for holding those groups. And I'm gonna do better going forward.
Karen, thank you so much for saying all that, and it's really great to see you and be on your show. And honestly, when I reached out to you, you were involved in so many things, and you were so busy. My assumption was always like, she's got more important things on her plate than to come and do this specific study group or discussion group. So,
Well, but that's where my priorities were out of whack. This is what I should have. This is very, very important work for white anti-racists to do if we're going to build an embodied white anti-racist culture, and really grow this movement. We have to come together and work through our stuff collectively, and really learn about all of our ancestors. I'd like to share a quote with you, that my mentor Karen Clapton recently shared with me, and it really reminded me of your work. It's from Alice Walker. To acknowledge our ancestors means we are aware that we did not make ourselves, that the line stretches all the way back, perhaps to God or to gods. We remember them because it is an easy thing to forget, that we are not the first to suffer, rebel, fight, love, and die.
That's such a powerful quote. And it makes me think of, being in Black freedom struggle spaces. There's always this calling in of ancestors. There's always this recognition of standing on the shoulders of incredible people. There's always this recognition that there's a lot of wisdom and experience to learn from. And I think that sometimes in white anti-racist spaces, there's not that similar recognition that, oh yeah, there's actually people with a lot of wisdom that we could learn from, people with experiences that we can learn from. And we don't have to reinvent the wheel every time we try to do, white anti-racist work. We're standing on the shoulders of incredible movement, ancestors as well. And I think that sometimes white people do have a harder time recognizing that. And I think part of the reason why is because the history is invisible. So that's part of what I'm trying to do, is to make sure that that history is no longer invisible, so that white people can, do some, so that white folks aren't reinventing the wheel all the time, and so that they have sources of inspiration, so that they have sources of anti-racist wisdom that they can tap into.
Thank you so much for doing that work. And also how their tactics, what were their tactics that were most useful? I have been reading this book about the abolitionists. It's about Harriet Tubman's decades-long friendship with two white women who were abolitionists. The name of the book is The Agitators, not The Abolitionists. But these two white women, had been involved in the abolitionist movement, were women's rights activists. But when they became friends with Harriet, she really inspired them to become much more bold and radical. And for Harriet to be friends with them, she gained tremendous access to resources, and to influence. One of the women's husbands was in Lincoln's cabinet, so Harriet could tell her something, and she would literally get it into the ear of President Lincoln. But it's so interesting reading about what they did not like, which was the work of going door to door. So the abolitionists would go door to door, trying to persuade white people that slavery was wrong and needed to be abolished. And I remember when I first heard about that tactic, I was like, what? Go door to? That sounds so weird. But that's what it's going to take to grow this movement.
Yeah, that going door to door, that's something that I've seen over and over again in white anti-racist history. That's how the Quakers, they were not originally an anti-racist group, but it was individual Quakers, white Quakers, taking it upon themselves and traveling, in a time where traveling meant riding a horse, traveling from town to town, going to congregation, and knocking on the doors of individual Quakers until the entire organization became an abolitionist organization.
Wow.
Um,
Wow.
yeah,
Pause. Let's
yeah,
pause on that.
yeah.
That's the work. That is the work to flip an entire organization person by person. I think about how unions do it. You know, they make a list of everyone in the workplace and they categorize them as friendlies, neutrals, and antis. And then they start going to the friendlies first and talking with them individually.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Going back to this concept of ancestors in Black organizing spaces, I think part of the reason why white people um, don't evoke our ancestors is because when you are a white anti-racist and you realize, wow, my ancestors caused tremendous harm,
Mm-hmm.
I caused tremendous harm, there's this deep shame. White people cause tremendous harm. There's this deep shame and guilt that comes from that. And for me, showed up in desire to separate myself
Mm-hmm.
from my ancestors, separate myself from white people. And I think subconsciously that was probably behind why I did not respond when you invited me to that study group.
Mm-hmm.
And as I mentioned earlier, like now I realize that is the wrong thing to do. The right thing to do is to come together and to work through our collective trauma together and hold each other to account together so that we can work through all of our racialized trauma.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I want to appreciate how vulnerable you are, honestly, in sharing, like, oh, and just simply bringing up the fact that there were these study groups that you could have come to. I really appreciate you sharing that, and um, I think that there's so much to talk about here. One thing that I want to bring up in response to this is along the lines of the notion of ancestors. I think that when white people are talking about their ancestors, they're typically thinking of their biological ancestors. And there's often a lot of the shame, is rooted in, biological ancestry. Even if they don't know what exactly their biological ancestors did, it's a pretty fair assumption to make that, if you're a white person and you go back a number of generations in the US, that your ancestors have, probably been involved with supporting systems of racial inequity in some way, shape, or form. That's like, and you might have some abolitionist ancestors too. But so I think it is easy to feel shame around that. Um, the type of ancestors that I'm focused on, I'm trying to shift it to this notion of, yeah, we have our biological ancestors, and we don't have control over, over our biological ancestors, and what they did does not determine, who we are and the choices that we make in our lives. Um, but we do also have movement ancestors. And so movement ancestors is kind of like, regardless of what our biological ancestors did, our movement ancestors are the type of ancestors that we aspire to be, kind of aspirational ancestors, people in whose lineage we would like to walk. So it's a question of, what kind of white people do we want to be, and who are the people who have looked like that in the past? And so I think of those as just like we can have a notion of chosen family. Like sometimes our biological family doesn't work for us. I'm very lucky in that it does, but I have a lot of friends who, they had to leave their families and really create chosen families. And I think sometimes for white folks, we need to create the notion of chosen family. There's also this notion of chosen ancestry in terms of um, yeah, deciding how you want to show up in the world as a white person, looking at who has shown up that way in the past, and then following on that image.
Yeah, I early in 2020, I was able to visit Harper's Ferry, and it is fantastic. I highly recommend visiting Harper's Ferry. That's the site of John Brown's raid on the Arsenal, and then nearby is the town where John Brown was jailed and eventually hung with the other folks who participated in that. And it was so transformative to actually visit that site. And there's a lot of there's a lot of exhibits, and it's also the site where the NAACP was founded, and the reverence that Black people had for John Brown, and preserving the farmhouse where they had planned the raid on Harper's Ferry, and that became like a club, and they would have musical performances and everything like that. But to actually go and walk in those spaces and to feel the energy, the spirit that is in that space, it really it was so strengthening to my commitment, and makes me question my commitment. Like, how far am I willing to go? Look at what he was willing to do. Look at, it wasn't just him, it was his whole family. They were all involved in supporting his efforts. Some of his sons were in the raid, and even his daughters were like the scouts for it, or kind of like the decoy while they were in the farmhouse getting ready to do it. Yeah, what does that bring up for you? Is there a particular connection to an ancestor that has been powerful for you?
Well, I mean, first I want to say with the not John Brown specifically, but what that experience brings up for me, that you had, this experience of being in Harper's Ferry and asking yourself, like, wow, like he really put everything on the line, and the way and it's clearly something that you feel, like you're not just thinking about something, you're there in the space and you're feeling this in your body. And it's making you question, how far do I go? And one thing that comes up for me when I think of the importance of looking at white anti-racist history and white anti-racist ancestors is that when we look at a range of them, like maybe you don't want to be John Brown specifically, maybe you're going to, you could be just as committed. But figure out, like, what does it mean to, how do you want to show up as a white anti-racist? And one of the things that I think is powerful about looking at a wide range of white anti-racists is that we could see people who we really relate to. Like, we can have this feeling of, like, what am I willing to do? What am I able to do? But I think it's when we look at that broader range of white anti-racists that we see people who remind us of ourselves. Like, maybe they have similar skills to us. Like, I had this experience, Karen, which I think you would have loved. There was it's a local school where during the George Floyd uprisings, a middle school, and these white students created a white affinity group. And so I was invited to go talk with these students, and I brought them like 20 different white anti-racists, and there's just one page, 3 paragraphs each about these 20 different people. And these students all gravitated towards the white anti-racists that had shared interests and shared skills that they have. And they all were able to see, like, oh, here's how a musician puts, like, here's Zilphia Horton. Here's how she puts her abilities as a musician into the service of the movement. Or Bob Fitch, movement photographer. Here's how he puts photography into the service of the movement. Jack Minnis, researcher for SNCC. This research guy putting his research skills into the service of the movement. And so I think one of the powerful things about seeing the breadth of white anti-racist history as well as the depth is that it allows each of us to contemplate our role a little bit better.
I love that story, Lynn. I know at right around that time, a friend asked me to speak to a high school student, a white high school student, who was having his racial awakening. And he had plunged into a deep depression because
Hmm.
he's like, I'm white and white is evil. So I am evil, And I think it's so important to give white young people great examples to follow, that yes, you can be white and you can also be a strong anti-racist practitioner.
Yeah.
And you're part of a long legacy of white people who have realized that white supremacy is wrong and have worked to dismantle it. So it's not that you have to self-destruct or walk around in deep guilt and shame, but you can have this is also something I debate with my mentors a lot. I think it's important that we create a positive white racial identity without the oppressive behaviors. Because I feel that no one wants to join a movement where people feel like shit all the time. Like, we have to have a way of being white without the oppressive behaviors. Um, and I think like connecting to who our ancestors are is a really important part of that process. And I just want to encourage, if you are watching us and you have questions for Lynn or I, or comments about what we're talking, please share them. We would love to answer your questions as well. But what is your response to that, Lynn?
Yeah, well, first I want to echo I also would love to know what the audience is thinking. If people have questions, that would be really exciting to see what's coming up for folks. What's coming up for me, I think there's two main things. One thing that's coming up for me is that we need to raise a new generation of white children. We need to raise a white anti-racist generation. And this is part of, I think of the resources that I create, I think of them as strategic resources. I think of them as strategic resources that can help us right now, that can help us in the immediate moment. But we always need to be thinking of the long haul. We need to always be keeping our eyes on the prize, and that's a long-term game. And we need resources that can support us in making that long-term transformation. And part of that needs to be raising a white anti-racist generation. So it is my hope that that white children can see positive examples of how white people can show up in the world in really powerful ways, and that they think to themselves, I'd like to be like that. I'd like to be like Ann Braden. I'd like to be like Bob Zellner, whoever it happens to be. That's one of the things that inspires me to do the work that I do, is thinking of that. The second thing that comes up for me around this notion of shame is that shame doesn't serve the movement, and it doesn't serve yourself. Uh, the movement benefits from white people and from all people in the movement being happy, being healthy, having clarity, having energy. Shame erodes all of that, and it makes you show up it makes you show up in movement spaces, or even if you're not in movement spaces, maybe you're just thinking things through. It even erodes your ability to like really focus and be clear and to grow. One of the things that shame does is it really we should be like, our focus needs to be on changing the world. How do we take down white supremacy? How do we take down systems of racial inequity? That needs to be the focus. But when we're feeling ashamed, or when we're feeling guilty and we're stewing in that all the time, that means we're focused on ourselves and we're trapped in our own feelings. You know what I'm saying?
Say it 10 million times, Lynn Burnett. How can you be effective as a change agent when you're not even being effective in managing your own self and your own emotions?
since we're talking about white anti-racist history, it's also something that I see throughout history. A lot of, there is a constant when I look at brilliant white anti-racist freedom fighters, people who are wise and experienced. It is universal on this. None of them are like, yeah, guilt is a great thing for white people to stew in. Like, nobody thinks that.
Nobody says that. Yes, because it is debilitating. It is, you become literally your own worst enemy, and you're like trapped in this endless cycle of
Yeah.
self-doubt. And it can take a lot of work to get out of that, but don't start organizing until you have gotten out of that, because you will cause harm when you're stewing and brewing in that sea of guilt and shame.
Yeah, to add one more thing, as we're talking about guilt as something that's not productive, it is also at the same time a natural response at the beginning of your white anti-racist journey. It makes complete sense. If you're a white person and you suddenly are having this realization, or you're suddenly feeling like, how could I not have known this? If you're suddenly feeling incredibly ignorant and feeling, and feeling like maybe you've caused harm in your life that you weren't aware of, it makes sense that you go through a phase of feeling ignorant, feeling guilty, and it's so we shouldn't be down on ourselves for if we are having those feelings.
100%. And it's not only at the beginning. I went through that very intensely at the beginning, and there's still other things other times when I cause harm, or when a situation happens, harm happens in front of me, and I don't address it. There's so many other times when I feel intense guilt and shame too. And that's why it's so important to be in community with other white anti-racists who can help you to process those feelings and learn from these experiences and actually grow.
Exactly. Yeah, where do you find those, if you don't mind me asking you a question, where do you find those white anti-racist spaces?
Well, I recently did Resma Menakam's workshop in somatic abolitionism. And I am now, some of the folks who were there, first of all, highly recommend that workshop. And I'm going to be doing his course in somatic abolitionism this year. And that I think the registration is still open for that. I highly, highly recommend it. So not only was the workshop itself so healing and transformational for me as an individual, for us collectively, all the people who were there, but I also left with a WhatsApp text group of white people who were there, and we do like a monthly Zoom call, and it has been so powerful. It's very intergenerational. It's very national. Like, there's folks from all across the country. And I really, really have benefited so much from those monthly calls. And then I've really also cultivated my relationships with different white anti-racist women, in both contemporaries and historical, like Anne Braden, like Lillian Smith, like reading about them, reading about these women who were friends with Harriet Tubman. That has been also very, very eye-opening. And just realize, I said it at Resma's workshop, that I realized for most of my time I have been running away from white people. And now and Resma was very clear. Listen, white people, you have one role in this, that is to collect your cousins. And so that hit me like a bucket of cold water. I'm like, okay, I'm going to stop running away from white people. I'm going to turn toward white people. And I want to see a whole field of flowers of, just all these white anti-racist people rising up, being in multiracial coalition, and uh healing our society, like a mass movement of them. And it was super inspiring, summer of 2020, to see Black Lives Matter protests all across the country,
Yeah.
led by young people, and there was a Black Lives Matter protest in the town that I grew up in Colorado, which
Mhm.
was a sundown town, which was a hotbed of the John Birch Society when I was growing up there. I mean, the idea that there would be it was like unfathomable to me. So I know that it can happen. And I just want us to take all that energy that we had in the summer of 2020 and keep it going, keep that movement going. I felt like the interest peaked and then it quickly waned.
Yeah.
So, but I know those people were activated then. And I think that's what it is. You have some transformational experience and then you see life in a different way.
Mhm.
And how can we sustain that energy going forward?
Mhm. Yeah. Oh, you said so much wonderful things right there. Um, yeah, I think one of the ways that we sustain that energy moving forward, like you're saying, finding community to plug into. And I think that community looks different for different people. Like you've been really inspired by Resma's work, and for those who don't know Resma, he wrote a book called My Grandmother's Hands. I think it's incredible. It really inspired the work that I do, and I believe he has a new book coming out in 6 months or so. But there's a lot of church spaces, religious spaces, Jewish, Quaker, Unitarian Universalists, and other spaces that are potential places where people can plug in. And one of the places that I plug in is working with Surge, showing up for racial justice. So if listeners don't know Surge, it's a white anti-racist organization with 150 chapters around the country. And they do great work. So check out your local Surge chapter. It's a very easy way to start building a white anti-racist community. And they will also help you plug into how you can support local Black and Brown-led racial justice efforts wherever you happen to live.
Yes. And next month, I'll be interviewing Garrett Bucks of the Barn Raisers Project, which is also really awesome, teaching white people how to organize white people in their community. Alyssa is on here. Alyssa and Vonda and I are the co founders of the Interracial Sisterhood Coalition. You can apply to be part of that. What else? I there for parents looking on how to raise their children anti-racist. I'm part of a group called Moms Allyship Against Racism. We are a Facebook group, so find us on Facebook and join us there. We do a lot of programming. There's so many resources to come together in community. Another great resource, Integrated Schools. This is an organization for white parents who are sending our children to global majority schools. So there's a lot of really amazing resources out there. And if you're wondering, seriously, if you have questions about this, if you're stewing and brewing in doubt and shame, call, like literally message me, DM me. I talk to people all the time. We will figure out how you can get connected to a group in your local area. And Alyssa asks, would love to hear from both of you which white anti-racist you admire. Love the idea of modeling the behavior and having white role models in the fight for anti-racism. Yeah. So, the anti-racists who I most admire are the from the past. I love the Grimke sisters, who were daughters of a slave owning family and rebelled and left and were early abolitionists. I love the women in this the book that I was mentioning, the agitators, um, who were they lived in upstate New York, and they were very active throughout the 1800s period. Lillian Smith is incredible. Lillian Smith was a white woman who was raised in Florida, and her family owned a summer camp in Georgia, and she took over that summer camp and made it into kind of like a white abolitionist consciousness raising program for Southern white girls. And she's like an incredible writer. She was very close with Dr. Martin Luther King. Anne Braden, who Lynn mentioned. And so Anne and Carl Braden, when a Black family wanted to buy a home in Kentucky, Louisville, Kentucky, and was unable to buy it in the neighborhood they wanted, they approached Anne and Carl Braden to buy it for them, which they did. And then when white people found out that a white family had done this, they violently attacked both the Black family and her husband Carl, who was imprisoned and charged with sedition. And Anne did this incredible organizing effort and was able to bail him out, and was like lifelong abolitionist, very involved in the movement. When I look across who are some of the people who I most admire contemporarily, they're not like, some of the super big name people, but my friend Mindy Gulati, who's in Austin, Texas, is an incredible white anti-racist ally. My friend Amanda Hambrick Ashcraft in New York City is a minister and a really incredible person. These are the folks who really come to mind when I think about like my contemporaries. And then there's a lot of other ones that whose stuff I read, but we don't have a close personal relationship. Molly is saying my anti-racist community includes a local showing up for racial justice chapter. Yes, exactly. Thank you for sharing the link too. And Lynn, who are some of your heroes?
I think the way that I want to answer the question is, if I had to imagine all the search chapters across the country and different white anti-racist groups across the country, if I had to imagine like the top 3 stories that I would want all of these groups to know, I would say Anne Braden, and then I would say Miles and Zilphia Horton, and the Highlander story. And then I would say the white SNCC experience. And there's so many white folks who showed up in SNCC in incredible ways. It's hard to focus on one of them, but the general experience of white people in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. I would maybe highlight Bob Zellner, especially for myself. Something that I love about Bob's work is that I'm trying to think how to say this. So there's this moment in SNCC history where they decide to become an all-Black organization. So SNCC grows out of the sit-in movement. They're pivotal in Selma and getting the voting rights passed. They're master grassroots organizers, and they're an interracial group. But to not get into the whole story, they decide at some point, 66, 67? My history's a little off. But they decide that they're going to become an all-Black organization for some really interesting reasons that I think white folks can learn a lot from by even looking at how that happened. And SNCC asks all of their white members to not simply leave SNCC, but to go and focus on organizing other white people. And Bob Zellner was one of the people who, he was a deeply trusted member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He's most well known for putting his body on the line again and again, but he's also someone who just built a very deep level of trust, in the way that he showed up in the movement. But he's one of the people from SNCC who really took that to heart. And when he left SNCC, he devoted his energy precisely to doing what SNCC had asked him to do, which was to organize other white folks. And he did that in the poor white working class South, you know, in the late 60s. He was someone who was willing to, and I'm not necessarily advocating that we do this, but he was someone who was perfectly willing to sit down and have a beer with union members, even if, you know, a third of them were like in the Ku Klux Klan. You know, he would sit down with them and say, all right, you guys aren't successful with your unionizing because you're not willing to work with black folks. And so I'm here, you know, I work with SNCC, you know where I come from, and I know where you come from. But if you guys want to have a successful union, you know, you got to get together, you know, with your fellow black and brown workers and come together. And if you're down to experiment with that, I'll be here to help you. And so he really pushes forward these multiracial unionizing efforts and is doing this work of organizing poor working class white people, which to this day, I think that's still a growing edge. If we look at white anti-racist spaces, they're, you know, they're very often like more middle class or more upper class. So I think that Bob Zellner's legacy inspires me, both because he's willing to sit down with folks that he doesn't agree with, and he's able to help them make sense of things. He's able to get into like the way that they're thinking. He's able to cross some bridges, and his commitment to working with poor and working class white people is really inspiring to me too.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that story. Molly or Dan says, this has been great. I'm involved in workplace employee resource groups and see these as great tools to involve white folks in the fight for racial justice. Yes, Dan. I mean, it's interesting, right? Because we live in such socially segregated, residentially segregated environments, oftentimes the only places where we meet folks across difference is in the workplace. And I think I could go on for a long time about employee resource groups and dysfunction and all this stuff, but employee resource groups that function well can serve as a really great opportunity for learning and transformation when you have folks involved who want to make it into a powerful tool for learning and transformation. And when yeah, I think I mean I would be curious to hear about your workplace experience. I don't know, have you ever been involved in a workplace based affinity group, Lynn?
You know, I think without realizing it, yeah. There was a group when I was teaching at Castlemont High School. We had a group of white teachers who would get together and reflect. And at the time, I wasn't necessarily conceiving of it as an affinity group, but it was just clear to us that that was an important thing to do. So we kind of made it happen.
You know, I used to think the concept of a white affinity group, a white employee resource group, was very strange. But now I realize it could be very powerful to have an employee resource group dedicated to white anti-racism and white self-transformation, collective transformation, is really important for building that cross-cultural solidarity. That's like what Bobby Seale said: you can't fight racism with racism, you fight racism with solidarity. So collecting our people and getting our cousins to do this self-work together, so that we can show up and be in true solidarity. That's how we grow the movement. Great. So as we're nearing the end of our conversation, is there anything that you would like to I have one question that I ask in every one of these, which is, if you could wave a magic wand and get white anti-racists to stop doing something or start doing something, what would it be?
Oh man. I'm going to give two responses. The first one is just what we're talking about. I think that we need to be more willing to go and talk with our fellow white folks, and in an active and proactive way. You know, I'm thinking of those Quakers knocking on doors and turning the entire Quaker religion into an abolitionist one. That happened with a lot of door knocking. So I think there's a lot of room to do more proactive outreach, reaching out to white folks in your life. And the other one that I would say is, you know, we need joy and laughter and self-care in this work. We need to be enjoying each other, and that's just because you are a valuable person and you deserve that. But also because if we do not do that, then we burn out, and our organizations will burn out. And if you have an organization that's burning out and there's high turnover, that means that organization never develops the wisdom and the deep roots and the capacities that it's able to have. So joy, laughter, wisdom, community, get to know people, go out to dinner with people, build some real community. You don't have to be doing activism all the time. You know, sometimes it's important, if you're organizing with folks, just to, you know, go out and take a walk in the woods together. You know, whatever it is, find ways to bond and just enjoy each other.
Thank you so much for that, Lynn. How can people connect with you, support your work?
There's a few ways to connect. One is to go to my website, crossculturalsolidarity.com. There's a wealth of racial justice history resources there, including and that includes white anti-racist history resources, but racial justice history resources in general. And if you're feeling like deeply moved and you want to see these resources, just Google my name, Lynn Burnett, Google White Anti-Racist Ancestry Project, and you'll see a GoFundMe for it if you're feeling, you know, like you'd want to lift that up. That's another thing.
Thank you so much, Lynn. I'm so grateful for all your wisdom, for your work, for all you're doing to inspire the anti-racist generation. And I look forward to coming to your next White study group. This time when you invite me, I will respond.
Right on, Karen. Thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you. Thank you for everyone who joined us. I'm so grateful. Please tune in next week. It's going to be awesome. Same time, 8 a.m. Pacific on Thursday morning on January 20th. The guest will be Rebecca Giacomo Antonio, who is a white woman, millennial, who leads groups for white women. And she is fantastic. I'm super excited for our conversation on January 20th. So if you enjoyed today, please share this with someone who needs to hear it. Invite them to come on January 20th. If you have feedback for these conversations or thoughts on who you would like me to interview, please do let me know. I am formulating this series as we go along, and I welcome your feedback. Thank you, everybody, and have a great day. Thank you, Lynn.
Thank you so much.
Okay, bye.